I now want to discuss the time period. I now want to discuss my third point, which is Mesopotamia, as we often call it, the time period of 6000 to 2000 BCE. Although we're calling it Mesopotamia for our purposes, you might be saying, where the heck is that? Well, maybe not. If you had to go to take a history class like I did in high school and middle school, where your history teacher was obsessed with Mesopotamia, then you've probably heard that name enough to make you want to roll over and vomit. However, if you are not familiar with it, Mesopotamia is essentially a stretch of land through Syria, stretching through Iraq, and almost into Iran. And it is during this time period, 6000 to 2000 BC, we see an area of the world where you suddenly see the rise of very, very large, some of our very earliest, very largest cities. And I say the rise of cities and everything else terrible about your life. I'm joking, of course, but you do start to see some of our clearest early examples of military expansion by sort of rulers that want to take other people's lands and take a lot of taxes from folks. And so it starts to be an intense time period from the perspective of the old-timey commoners. But before we get there, you have the Fertile Crescent, which for some reason, my slides got really messed up there. There we go. Thank you. So the Fertile Crescent we use that term for essentially between around 5000 BC, 4000 BC, you have a relatively fertile time and a less arid or less dry time period for this part of the world. And it was a very, very good time for farming, and that the idea has classically been that it gave birth to modern agriculture, modern cities, and sort of civilization in its entirety. And it's called the Fertile Crescent because it was both very good for farming and roughly shaped like a crescent, stretching from essentially Palestine, Israel, Levant, and Lebanon, through Syria, through Iraq, into the mountains of Iran, the Zagros Mountains. And so a rather large place, and of course one pivotal in understanding human history. It also, in some formulations, also encompasses Egypt as well. And again, major empires whose influence spread far and wide. As time has gone on, that picture has become more and more complicated, not the least of which because we've realized that where crops were domesticated is actually roughly a dozen different places across the world, right? So the Fertile Crescent is the birthplace of wheat, but there are all sorts of other crops, including many of our top 10 crops that we eat to this day, such as potatoes and corn, which were domesticated other places. Interestingly, many of these domestications happened either 10,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. We also now realize that the Fertile Crescent is kind of more like two crescents, an upland and a lowland crescent, that were trading material back and forth. So the upland crescent of people who were doing a lot more of the animal herding, but some of the farming as well, they were sending flint down south, and the people on the lower edge who were certainly doing pastoralism and also a lot of farming were sending shells up because they had, of course, easy access to shells, right? So there was a back and forth trade that we call the Levantine corridor. In this lowland area, you have really, really interesting archaeological sites like the Ubaid sites from 6000 to 4200 BC, which are these small but steady permanent villages that have sheep, goats, barley, wheat, but are also clearly doing a ton of hunting, which is really interesting. And you have the gradual growth of larger and larger buildings, including things like the tripartite temple to Enki, who's a water god. It's still not really, it's still villages though. Let's call it what it is. It's still villages, even though things are getting bigger. But things are starting to change. By 3500, for example, in roughly the same area, you have Uruk, or Warka, which is one of our first true cities, by which we mean there are tens of thousands of people in a relatively small area with 4 miles of farms around them as part of feeding into this centralized palace temple thing, what we sometimes call a ziggurat. And from what we can tell from written records, basically people, first of all, they counted time in a really interesting way where you had 10-day weeks and 3 of them, that was your month. But you have clearly people producing a bunch of labor to build these ziggurats. By 3100, only 400 years later, the population collapses, the city collapses, usually a sign that something has gone wrong in a pretty notable way, though not always. By the way, this is a vase from that time period from 3000 BC. And as you can see, there's really, really strong agricultural themes everywhere. And you have a ton of these people who look almost identical to each other that are carrying food in containers. Again, it's a bit of a shot in the dark when we're interpreting the past in this way. But what we think is probably going on there is they're essentially bringing forth like tribute. So it's like kind of early taxation, right? Except for when we pay our taxes, we generally pay them fully clothed and not in the form of large baskets of wheat. Some other things that are going on in this kind of lower Fertile Crescent area is the birth of the Sumerian city-states around 2500 BC. And suddenly you start to see city-states, by which I mean like a city that's clearly a civilization unto itself that has its own army and is starting to vie with or compete with other groups. You have the Ur-3 Empire, and then you have the Ur-3 Empire that crashes. Their population very quickly declines. Or rather their city population does. When a city population declines precipitously, it often means that the people just go other places and farm other places, but the city crashes. I said, don't be a boring nerd or civilization will crash. What I mean by that is that there's different theories for why Earth crashed. One of them is that they oversalinated their crops. They did too much irrigation, which if done wrong in arid areas can cause there to be a calcic salt buildup on the surface, which harms your plants and makes it much harder to grow. You can see this as they shift from wheat to barley, which is more salt tolerant. Anyways, why were people over farming? Well, apparently they were being heavily taxed by the bureaucrats being the people that had developed this beautiful writing system that we call cuneiform. That is one of our earliest writing systems, perhaps the earliest writing system. And they were off there doing all sorts of complex recordings of people and the tribute they're paying, while the people, meanwhile, are overly working the land to the point where eventually it crashes. That's one of the theories. So, be careful what you wish for, right? Cuneiform is an amazing accomplishment, and it apparently came at the expense of some people working very, very hard to support the people that were developing and using cuneiform and using it to chart tribute in obscenely specific detail. By the way, this is a cemetery from Ur from 2500 BC, and as you can see, really, really beautiful bead and golden ornamentation that's happening in this time period. I'm now going to time jump sort of 6,000 years into the past to talk about sort of the upland area of this area. And so I'm going to talk about Göbekli Tepe, so 9,500 to 8,000 BC, where you have, among other things, 16-foot tall, huge T-shaped pillars with these amazing carvings of various wild animals, among other things. And you have a group of people who did eat cereal, by which I mean not like Fruit Loops or something, or Cheerios, but by that I mean like things like grain. But we can't really tell sometimes if they're farmers or not. If they were farmers, that's weird. They're picking it up really early, and there's some things about that that would be weird. If they weren't farmers, if they were farmers, that would be interesting. If they weren't farmers, that would be very strange. Why are they eating a bunch of grain, but they're not actually farming, but they are living in cities? That would all be kind of a little bit confusing. And so this is a fascinating time period. If you're interested in it, you can check out this website, insta.blog/the Tepe Telegrams, which has archaeologists talking about their research there. I now want to talk about a city that I find fascinating and love talking about, but I hate actually talking about it verbally because it is a hard for me to pronounce name involving letters that we don't have in English. So I will do my best, and please do not mock me on YouTube, okay? But Catalhoyuk is a very, very fascinating archaeological site that stretched about 1,500 years from 7,400 to 5,900 BC and is in this sort of upland Fertile Crescent area, specifically in Turkey. It's about 30 acres wide. Only about 5% of it has actually been excavated by archaeologists like this. It is, I'm calling it a proto-city, but the population is big. I mean, if you're going to call this a proto-city, you'd have to call Sultan or Kenai the same thing, because the population here is 5 to 10,000. I mean, that's quite large for the time period. It's not small even for our time period. Interestingly, though, one of the things about this place is that there are very specific home plots that clearly stretched over centuries. You can tell where there was a wall and a platform and different things. And then after about 100 years, they took the whole thing down and then built another house of basically the exact same dimensions, the same walls, the same platforms right on top of it. So it's successive layers. And the houses themselves, not only are they sort of uniform throughout time, mostly looking the same, but they're uniform across space, by which I mean that you and your next door neighbor have very, 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 very similar looking houses. It's sort of cardboard cutout copies of each other, and there's no streets, and instead you enter your house from ladders and come from the top. But there is spaces between the different buildings, but there's not like true streets in the way we would think of them now. And there are a lot of buildings where there's, you know, spaces between some but not others. It's kind of like a really, really dense apartment complex, but one that you have to enter from the very top by climbing on a ladder. And then there's enclosures outside of them where they're keeping cattle. Inside, they have really, really interesting things. One of them, so a couple really, really interesting things going on. One of them is they are farming, which is allowing them to have this really large population. However, the farming is flood retreat farming, which is essentially one of the, I don't want to call it lazy because it's by no means lazy, but one of the simplest forms of farming you could possibly do. Basically, the part of the world where they are, the river retreats during the late spring/summer, and so it leaves a bunch of really fertile soil as it goes, but it also kind of tills the soil naturally through the river current runoff as it goes, and it also kind of rearranges all the soil every single year. And so, contrary to our idea of sort of farmers always setting up fences, it would have been pretty much impossible to have fences in this situation. Your farm, where there's usable farmland, is shifting every single year. So you have to have a society that's getting along really well to figure out who goes where each year, because nobody can really have private property in the sense of private land property. And what's also interesting is that if you go inside Catalhoyuk houses, we can tell that they had beautiful statues. So like mounted auroch heads and also artwork of aurochs. So again, these kind of like wild cow creatures with these huge horns, and all sort of wall imagery that's supposed to look like hunting, which is weird because we can tell from people's food residues on their floors that they were eating mostly the stuff that they farmed, but they're still for like 1,500 years, well, like 1,000 years, defining themselves fundamentally as hunters. It'd be sort of like if every single house in the United States had taxidermy on the wall, had like elk or caribou heads on the wall, even though most people nowadays, this is maybe a bad metaphor for Alaska, but most people nowadays in the lower 48 are obviously getting most of their food from the grocery store. So it's this kind of weird time, like just a weird city in a lot of ways. And then weird in one more final way that I think is most important to bring out, which is that in Catalhoyuk, there is essentially uniform houses and there's no palaces. So you have, again, a city of 5,000 to 10,000 people. Many social scientists and historians assume that when you get above a certain population, it becomes almost impossible. There's so many interactions between so many people, many of whom are strangers, that you have to have some kind of a central governing body. It makes logical sense. It's what we've assumed for a long time. The more we've researched Catalhoyuk and a number of other sites, the more we start to question that, because apparently we had a group of roughly 10,000 people who, as far as we can tell, didn't have a ruler, and yet somehow all coexisted in extremely close quarters and in a context in which you had to constantly coordinate who got which farmland. It is fascinating. I hate to call it utopia. I'm sure they had any number of bad things about their society, but it is certainly bewildering in what they were able to do without any sort of central government. It's if not utopia, it looks a little utopianist to modern people. The fifth thing I wanted to point out was the invention of modern writing. Of writing, period. So about 3,300 years ago, cuneiform gradually shifts into other forms of writing as well. Cuneiform, you basically use like a reed or like a heart, like stone stele, to carve shapes into clay, and then you make cuneiform. But writing actually develops independently in several parts of the world. Off in ancient Mesoamerica, you have the Mayans who are developing their own writing system, which is very different. It's a syllabic and ideographic system where basically each symbol represents quite a bit of content, in part because there's oftentimes like image and then also sound. So it's a letter. It's not actually a letter, but it's a letter in the sense that you and I think of it. It can represent a word or a part of a word, but it's also a picture representing whatever it represents pictograph as a picture visually. So it's kind of like two layers of meaning. So it's not the way that, generally speaking, you or I think of reading. And I want to talk about writing. So writing develops independently in several places. Of course, in East Asia, we are gradually seeing the development in the same time period of the past 5,000 years. Of those scripts as well. And so we have multiple independent spheres of development of alphabets, of ideographic systems, of the Egyptian system, of the character systems, so many different kinds of writing developing, but all kind of in the same time period, which is really interesting. And it suggests that these places had enough food for some people to be really, really working on their writing. And it's fascinating. Interestingly, often, but not always, early writing had to do with taxation, which is just an interesting thing to remember. So I don't know what the message is there. You enjoy reading books? Thank the IRS. I don't know what the message is there, but oftentimes early writing had to do with taxation or just with trade, with people marking so-and-so was trading with so-and-so as an easy way to keep track of trades. I want to now talk about the concept of collapse of civilizations. And so the idea of a collapse of civilizations is that we sometimes have this idea of like the collapse of the ancient Egyptians, or well, more like the collapse of Earth 3 or the collapse of ancient Mayans and stuff like that, or like where did the ancient Mayans go? Collapse is kind of a misnomer. For example, with the ancient Mayans, the population did decline for a while, but more so the population moved out into other areas. And when the Spaniards showed up, there were still Mayan people. They just weren't living in places like Chichen Itza, right? They weren't living in sort of these mega cities with huge pyramids, but like they were still around. They were just farming in small villages out in the rainforest. And so collapse of civilizations is sort of in the eye of the beholder. And the question is it a good or a bad thing? From the perspective of the rulers, it's a very bad thing. All the people who were paying you tribute ran away. From the perspective of the commoners, this is sometimes a time period when the archaeological evidence suggests that the commoners either get sick of things, pack up and go somewhere else, or revolt against the central authority. So collapse is sort of in the eye of the beholder. For example, with the collapse of the Earth 3 dynasty around 2000 BC, which was apparently due to oversalinization of soil. Or as another example, you have the Rapa Nui of Easter Island. In their case, the dominant narrative, although it's been challenged by some, including some indigenous people of Easter Island, but the dominant narrative is that these large stone heads on Easter Island, the Moai, that they were symbolic of certain lineages and certain spiritual, but more so kinship ideas of certain lineages, and that they have to be transported, these huge stone heads, from the quarries using logs and ropes that were constructed from the trees. And so there's kind of a double whammy of cutting down too many trees to transport the stone heads, plus rats eating all the seeds so that it was hard for regermination. And so eventually, by the time Europeans show up, there's essentially no trees, and it's mostly scrubby, small vegetation and far less mammals and animals to hunt than there used to be. So it's often held up as sort of an example of how people, due to a certain political or religious system, were engaging in something that was very unsustainable until they cut the final tree, as it were. Again, there's been pushback on that from indigenous folks of that area, but that is sort of the predominant anthropological narrative. Or we could talk also about the collapse of the ancient Maya from 1000 BC to so the ancient Maya, as we sometimes call them, when people say that, they roughly mean the time period of 1000 BC to 900 CE, although there's specific time periods within that of pre-classic, classic, and post-classic. First of all, before we even get into Mayan civilization proper, you have the fascinating city of Teotihuacan from 100 BC to 550 CE, which was very, very strange in a lot of ways archaeologically. Its estimates range from 25,000 to 125,000, which is a huge margin, but it's essentially a city full of multiple different temples, where you have like a temple to sun, a temple to moon, and a temple to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. But you'll have like 3 temple complexes, but you'll have like multiple throughout the city. So like multiple areas have these 3 temples together, which is interesting. And also Teotihuacan people, in their city, they had people speaking all sorts of different languages from surrounding areas, and they seem to have sort of exported their religious ideas and artistic ideas to other areas. And later empires, Mayan empires, the groups that nowadays we call the Aztec empires, including the Mixtec and the Nahua, they would reference back to the Teotihuacan period and be like, we are the descendants of the Teotihuacan. It was like a point of pride. It was like this kind of like metropolitan, highly advanced city that then disappeared, and everybody sort of always referenced back to, which is interesting. Ancient Mesoamerica itself is kind of a fascinating time period, but I'm looking at how long. Yeah, this would probably be a good time to pause, because this is it's gonna take a bit to explain ancient Mesoamerica. It's not a short story, so let's pause there.